Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the world of Roman dining, and it's going to be a feast for your imagination. Picture this. You've just arrived at a grand Roman villa, the evening light casting soft shadows across the marble floors. The smell of roasting meats, baked bread, and sweet honey cakes fills the air. As you take a seat on plush cushions, a slave places a bowl of olives in front of you. You're about to experience a meal unlike anything you've had before. If, of course, you were somehow magically transported to this time, you'd probably have a tough time surviving the wine consumption alone, but we'll get there. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to drop your location and what time it is for you right now in the comments. I love seeing how far and wide this little bedtime history adventure goes. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start by picturing your first Roman dinner. The time, around the 1st century AD, when you, like any good Roman, would have dined with family and friends after a long day of work, military duties, or, if you were lucky, shopping in the grand marketplaces. Whether you were part of the elite or a humble citizen, Roman dining was serious business, and it wasn't just about the food. It was about status, social connection, and of course, the atmosphere. As you settle into your spot, you notice that Roman dinners were typically held in the evening, usually around sunset. For the wealthy, dinner wasn't just a meal. It was a social event, and it could stretch on for hours. Guests would recline on couches, leaning to their left on their elbow, a pose that would look suspiciously awkward today, but was considered supremely comfortable back then. Romans knew how to enjoy their food and their company. The wealthy often ate in a space called the triclinium, a dining room specifically designed to accommodate reclining guests. This wasn't just any room. Think beautifully painted walls, intricate mosaics, and of course, an elegant marble floor. But the real star of the room was the food. Banquets were elaborate, almost theatrical, and designed to impress. Of course, the menu varied greatly, depending on who you were and what your social standing was. But one thing was certain: the Romans were not shy about eating well. For the elite, a Roman dinner could be a parade of exotic ingredients and carefully crafted dishes, each one a testament to their wealth and influence in the empire. The first course might feature things like gustatio, a starter course of appetizers that included everything from fresh oysters to eggs drizzled with honey. Historians still argue whether Roman meals were ever quite as opulent as some of the surviving records suggest, but it's clear that food played a central role in Roman life, even for the lower classes. Dinner was a time to gather, share stories, and celebrate the fruits of the day's labor. Though their meals were usually simpler and less extravagant than those of the wealthy, as you sit back, you notice the subtle luxury that surrounds you, the soft glow of oil lamps flickering in the background, the sound of distant laughter from fellow guests, and of course, the inevitable clink of bronze plates and goblets. In ancient Rome, dinner was far from just a meal. It was an experience. As the evening progresses, the sun dips below the horizon, and you settle further into the rhythms of Roman dining. The slaves are busy circulating, offering you more gustatio, perhaps some salted fish, thinly sliced meats, or a dish of pickled vegetables. The first course is over, and you might be tempted to think that dinner is winding down. But no, not in ancient Rome. The cena, or main meal, is just beginning, and trust me, it's going to last a while. Now, it's important to understand that for the Romans, dinner wasn't a rushed affair. It was an event that unfolded in stages, often lasting for hours, sometimes stretching late into the evening. The cena was the heart of the Roman meal, and it wasn't just about what you ate. It was about how you ate, and more importantly, with whom you ate. As the evening continues, the courses roll in, each one more lavish than the last. The first course was usually something light, a way to tease the appetite. It might include eggs, vegetables, or fruits like figs, which, by the way, the Romans were wild about. But the real fun begins with the second and third courses, which were meatier. Literally, Romans were famous for serving a variety of meats, from the more common pork to the slightly more exotic goat or wild boar. The wealthier your guests, the fancier the meats you'd serve. Think roast peacock or stuffed flamingos. Yes, flamingos. Those fine feathered birds weren't just for their vibrant color. Their meat was considered a delicacy. Historians still argue whether flamingo meat was actually as tasty as the Romans made it out to be, but it seems it was more about status than flavor. As you recline, sipping your diluted wine in Rome was almost always cut with water. You may notice something unusual happening on the table. The slave or servant is bringing out large bowls of poles, which sounds boring, but trust me, it's anything but. Poles was a type of porridge made from barley or spelt, and for many Romans, it was the staple food, especially for the lower classes. But even this humble dish had its variations, sometimes seasoned with honey or spiced with pepper, garum, fermented fish sauce, or even olive oil. And it wasn't just about the food. The cena had its rituals. This was the time for entertainment, whether it was music, witty banter, or the occasional philosophical discussion. The Romans loved their dinner parties to be educational, as much as they were luxurious. You'd likely hear debates on Stoicism or the latest political drama, with guests reclining, philosophizing, and gesturing animatedly with their hands. And just when you think it's winding down, you realize there's more coming. Perhaps a dish of marietum, a fresh cheese spread mixed with herbs, or patina, a savory or sweet egg-based dish. Historians still debate how much cena varied from region to region, but it's clear that Romans took their meals seriously. If you were wealthy enough, you could afford exotic ingredients from all over the empire, brought in through trade routes or by slaves sent to distant lands. Garum, a fermented fish sauce, was all the rage at these feasts, used as both a condiment and a cooking ingredient. In fact, no Roman meal would have felt complete without it. Some dishes were so drenched in garum that you'd hardly know there was a fish involved. But, to be fair, we can't judge the Romans too harshly. They were known to add wine to nearly everything, so they certainly weren't afraid to experiment with flavor combinations. And for the Romans, Dinner wasn't just about eating, it was about showing off. If you were an elite Roman citizen, your meal was often a way to demonstrate your wealth and cultural sophistication. Your guests weren't just there for food, they were there to be impressed. The cena was a display of everything that made you important: your ability to procure rare ingredients, your knowledge of exotic dishes, and your mastery of Roman hospitality. When you served that peacock, you weren't just offering a bird for dinner, you were offering a story, a piece of the Roman world that had traveled across seas and centuries to reach your table. At the same time, the meal was also a chance to form alliances, strengthen friendships, or, if you were clever enough, make political statements. Dinner parties could last for hours, sometimes until the stars shone bright above the villa. You might be offered another glass of wine, or perhaps even invited to join the host for a walk around the garden afterward, assuming, of course, that you could still stand after the sheer volume of food you've consumed. Now that you've got a feel for the basic flow of a Roman dinner, let's focus on the essentials, the food itself. You may have started to notice that even in a world without refrigerators or sophisticated preservation techniques, the Romans had an impressive ability to keep things fresh and varied. Much of what they ate would seem familiar to us today, but the ways they prepared and served these dishes were as much about the experience as the taste. Bread, for example, was a staple in Roman life. You've probably heard the saying, bread and circuses. But what did that really mean in the context of Roman dining? For the majority of Romans, bread was the cornerstone of their diet. Whether they were part of the lower classes or the elite, bread was central to their meals. In fact, panis, or bread, was so important that it became a symbol of Roman life itself. If you were a wealthy Roman, your bread might be made from fine white flour, kneaded with olive oil, or even sprinkled with herbs to add extra flavor. But for the common Roman citizen, bread was often made from coarse grains like barley or oats, and its quality could vary greatly depending on where you lived and your social standing. The bread itself came in all sorts of forms: round loaves, flatbreads, and even libum, a kind of cheesecake, might appear at the table. But what's really interesting is the thermopolia, those small street-side shops you'd find all around the Roman Empire that sold hot, ready-to-eat meals, often involving bread. These places weren't just about convenience, they were social hubs. Think of them like the ancient Roman equivalent of a cafe, where you could grab a quick bite or meet up with friends. Historians still argue over how much variety existed in Roman breads. Did they truly have the same kind of artisanal loaves we see today, or were they mostly just plain and functional? Regardless of the exact details, bread was always a reliable part of any Roman meal, and it was as essential to their culture as it is to ours today. Next, let's take a moment to talk about poles. The Roman porridge I mentioned earlier, unlike today's quick oats or instant grits, poles was made from more than just grains. It often contained a mix of peas, lentils, or barley, and was boiled until it reached a thick, stew-like consistency. And don't think of it as just a simple peasant food. The wealthy added luxurious twists to their pools, including lamb, garum, and sometimes even spices like cinnamon and pepper. The rich may have also added a touch of honey to sweeten the dish. making it a versatile item on the table. Imagine you're having dinner at a wealthy Roman's villa, and pulse is served in one of the second courses. The pulse is hearty and comforting, the consistency of a thick risotto, with a rich flavor that's almost savory sweet. The honey adds a subtle sweetness, and the garlic or olive oil balances it out perfectly. It's a meal that sticks to your ribs and could easily keep you going for hours. Some sources even suggest that pulse was often served as a side dish alongside roasted meats, whether a fragrant shoulder of lamb or even roasted fowl. Another important part of the Roman diet was olives, both the fruit itself and the oil. Roman olive trees were prized possessions, often cultivated on sprawling estates, and the oil was considered an essential part of daily life. It wasn't just used for cooking. Romans would bathe in olive oil as a form of skincare, a practice still followed in some cultures today. Olive oil was also a key ingredient in most Roman recipes, adding flavor and richness to even the simplest meals. And let's not forget about garum, that pungent, fermented fish sauce that Romans absolutely adored. If you've ever smelled something that can only be described as smelly fish sauce, you can imagine why garum wasn't universally loved by modern scholars. But for Romans, it was the umami magic behind so many of their favorite dishes. It was used in everything from pulse to fish stews to meat dishes, and you could find it in nearly every Roman kitchen. In fact, some wealthy families had private garum factories where they created their own special blends. Whether or not garum was actually delicious is still a subject of some debate. Still, the Romans sure loved it. Of course, let's not forget that even the simple pleasures of dining, like the bread or pulse, were often elevated by the side dishes. Vegetables played a more important role than you might think, especially for the poorer classes, who couldn't afford large quantities of meat. Some of the most common vegetables included onions, leeks, beans, and cabbage. These were often served with bread or used in stews. Historians still argue whether the Romans had a vegetarian diet. There's certainly evidence that many preferred plant-based dishes, particularly among those who followed philosophical schools like Epicureanism or Stoicism. But meat was definitely seen as a mark of luxury. And as you continue dining at this cena, you'll soon find yourself being served the next dish, maybe pulse again, or perhaps a lighter vegetable salad with herbs and olives freshly picked from Roman gardens. The food may have been simple, but the Roman commitment to flavor, ritual, and community made each meal feel significant. Each dish was part of a larger story about power, wealth, and tradition. Dining was an opportunity for connection, whether you were sharing a loaf of bread with friends or showing off exotic ingredients that traveled thousands of miles to reach your table. It was about savoring the moment and embracing the wealth of the empire, even if that meant indulging in garum or eating something unusual like roasted dormice. As you relax into your meal, the luxurious aroma of roasting meats lingers in the air. You've sampled pulse, tasted bread seasoned with olive oil, and sipped diluted wine. But now the real star of the cena arrives, the secundae, or second courses, consisting of meats, fish, and fowl. These dishes were the highlight of any Roman feast, a chance for the host to showcase their wealth and culinary skill. For the wealthy, this was the part of the meal where extravagance took center stage. Think roast peacock, wild boar, or even stuffed flamingo, dishes that would leave your guests wide-eyed and talking for months. It's hard to imagine just how lavish these Roman feasts could get. You may have already had a taste of the simpler meats like lamb or chicken, but the truly rich would serve up something much rarer. Imagine this. You're reclining at the table, and a beautifully roasted peacock is brought out, its iridescent feathers still attached, spread out like a fan. It's not just about eating here, it's about the spectacle. As you sit back, someone might comment on how much this dish cost to procure, or how it was likely brought in from the distant reaches of the empire. Because, in ancient Rome, food was often more about status than taste. But what about those even more unusual dishes? One of the peculiar delicacies that Romans enjoyed was dormice. Yes, dormice. These small rodents were often stuffed with a mixture of minced meat and then roasted. It might sound strange today, but in Roman times, dormice were considered a real treat. They were typically served as part of the appetizer courses in banquets, often accompanied by honey and poppy seeds. The wealthy Romans didn't mind eating such peculiar dishes. They saw them as an indicator of their ability to indulge in the rarest, most exotic foods. Some even raised dormice in small, specially designed cages to ensure a fresh supply for their feasts. Historians still argue whether dormice were a regular part of the Roman diet, or just a quirky dish reserved for special occasions. Still, the fact remains that Romans were far less squeamish about what they ate than we are today. They were used to consuming all sorts of animals, and almost every part of the creature was used in cooking, whether it was roasted, boiled, or used to create sausages and other delicacies. It was a complete disregard for modern dietary norms and a reflection of the Romans' practical yet extravagant approach to dining. Another second-day favorite for wealthy Romans was wild boar. The boar was often slow-cooked over a flame and served with rich sauces, sometimes incorporating honey, wine, and garum. The flavor of the boar itself was robust, and the sauce added layers of richness, making it a highly sought-after dish. But not all boar was created equal. Some of the best cuts of boar were sourced from the wilds of northern Italy or Gaul, and they were transported to Rome in the same way rare spices and fruits were, via trade routes that stretched across the empire. When a dish like this arrived on your table, it wasn't just about eating, it was about experiencing the empire. But let's not overlook the fish. While Romans may have been known for their meats, fish had a key place in their cuisine. In fact, many of the second-day dishes would feature fish, either baked or grilled, often flavored with garum or other spices. The garum, as I mentioned earlier, was absolutely essential to Roman cooking. It was used in so many dishes that it became one of their most important exports, making it as ubiquitous as olive oil in their kitchens. As you continue your meal, you might find yourself served a fish stew or simply grilled fish, topped with fresh herbs, garlic, and a touch of garum for extra flavor. While we often think of the Mediterranean as a paradise of seafood, the Romans elevated this tradition, using their vast network of trade routes to bring in the best fish from across the empire. And then there's the dish. That's probably the most luxurious of them all. Stuffed flamingo. Yes, flamingos were a Roman delicacy. These birds were plucked, seasoned, and then stuffed with a rich mixture of minced meat, spices, and sometimes even the very same garum they used in their sauces. The idea behind serving a flamingo wasn't just to impress your guests with something exotic. It was about presenting something that was, literally, beyond the ordinary. Flamingos were rare, and in the eyes of the Romans, rarity equated to status. If you served flamingo at your feast, you were definitely someone who knew how to throw a party and how to show off. But it wasn't always about having the rarest dishes at your table. Sometimes, the simplest pleasures could make a Roman feast special. Fresh fruit, nuts, and a hearty bread could be just as satisfying as the most opulent dishes. This mix of extravagant and humble foods was part of what made Roman dining so unique. It was about balancing luxury with simplicity, showcasing the wealth of the empire while still honoring everyday staples. Historians still debate whether the obsession with exotic dishes like flamingo and dormice was a sign of overindulgence or just part of a long-standing cultural tradition of showcasing power. While some argue that it was a symbol of decadence, others suggest that these feasts were an expression of Roman pride, an attempt to highlight the empire's ability to procure resources from every corner of the known world. Either way, one thing is clear. The secundae of a Roman dinner were a spectacle that embodied the very essence of Roman life. Luxury, power, and indulgence all served on a platter. By now, your meal has progressed into the final courses, and the atmosphere has relaxed a little. Though the indulgence has not ceased, the secundae may have been the main event, but the true finishers, the desserts, are about to arrive, and these too are an essential part of the Roman dining experience. However, don't expect anything like the sugary confections we devour today. Roman desserts were often a subtle, almost restrained affair, though they were no less delicious. As the second courses wind down and guests begin to chat more freely, servers bring in the second day's companions: fruits, honey cakes, nuts, and the occasional surprise. The Romans, despite their lavish feasts, often kept their sweets simple, favoring fruits like grapes, figs, dates, and apples. These weren't just snacks. They were a way to cleanse the palate, freshen the taste buds, and provide a sweet contrast to the richness of the meats and sauces. But here's where things start to get a little more interesting. Imagine a dish that combines fruit with honey. Honey was the go-to sweetener of the Roman Empire, and they didn't shy away from using it in nearly everything, from pulls to desserts. Honey cakes, made from a mixture of honey, flour, and sometimes a bit of fruit, were a common end to a Roman feast. These cakes were soft and sticky, often served with a drizzle of fresh honey on top to enhance their sweetness. Historians still debate the exact recipe for these cakes, as no written recipes exist from ancient Rome, unless, of course, you count the Apicius cookbooks, but those are typically reserved for the high-end dishes. Regardless of the specifics, honey cakes were considered a sweet treat at the end of a lavish meal, and guests would often consume them as they relaxed in the fading light of the evening. Let's not forget about the more exotic forms of Roman sweets, though. For example, Romans had a fondness for musk cakes made from the unfermented juice of grapes, essentially a kind of early version of wine-infused cake. These treats were less sweet than our modern desserts, but they were flavored with various spices like cinnamon and pepper, adding a layer of complexity to what we might otherwise consider a simple dessert. As you finish off your honey cake or a handful of fresh figs, you may notice a small bowl of nuts being passed around the table. Romans, too, were fans of a variety of nuts, especially pistachios, hazelnuts, and almonds. These nuts weren't just a snack, they were also part of medicinal remedies, often prescribed by Roman physicians for everything from digestive issues to sleep disorders. A handful of nuts might just be what you need to stave off the sleepiness creeping in after such an indulgent meal. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the room, a servant brings out something even more unexpected: mulsum, a honeyed wine that could be served either hot or cold, depending on the season. Think of it as the ancient Roman version of mead. This sweet, wine-like drink was made by mixing wine with honey and sometimes adding spices like cloves or cinnamon. If you've ever had spiced mulled wine during the winter holidays, you can probably imagine how cozy this drink would have felt at the end of a lavish Roman meal. For Romans, mulsum wasn't just for dessert. It was a drink for celebration, used in toasts and often consumed in large quantities. Historians still argue whether mulsum was strictly a dessert drink or whether it was consumed throughout the entire meal. Regardless, it was a hit at Roman feasts, especially when paired with fruits, nuts, and cakes. Some even enjoyed it as a sort of palate cleanser, drinking a small glass between courses to refresh their senses. At this point in the evening, the table is full of remnants: empty wine cups, the bones of roasted meats, discarded fruit pits, and empty plates of honey cakes. You, along with the other guests, are likely feeling full, perhaps a bit sleepy from all the food, the wine, and the laid-back conversation. This is when the final course is served, a kind of digestive meant to help you relax after all the indulgence. The Romans had a knack for making sure you didn't leave their feasts feeling anything but content, and they knew that the right dessert could make a world of difference. Your last indulgence, a dish of libum, a kind of Roman cheesecake made with ricotta, honey, and a touch of bay leaf. It was baked, then drizzled with honey, and served warm, adding the perfect finish to an evening that has included everything from dormice to peacock to honey cakes. If you're lucky, it might even come with a sprinkle of fresh herbs for that final, gentle kick of flavor. At this point, as the evening winds down, you'll likely see the hosts offering small portions of wine, along with a final round of conversation. People are still lounging in the triclinium, but the mood has shifted to something more comfortable, relaxed. The lights are dim, the evening is drawing to a close, and it's time for guests to stretch out, let their food settle, and perhaps continue discussing the latest gossip or politics of the empire. Historians still argue whether these final courses were just about providing a rich, sweet ending to a meal, or whether they were part of a larger ritual to signify the end of the evening and the time for guests to slowly, lazily depart. Either way, your Roman feast has come to a close, and as the servants clear the table and the laughter fades into the night, you're left with the warm glow of indulgence and a full belly as the final bites of libum melt away. A serene calm descends over the gathering. The clatter of plates and the murmur of conversation slowly fade, leaving behind a soft, lazy satisfaction in the air. The Roman feast was not just a meal, it was an experience, a performance that unfolded over hours. And now, as the evening draws to a close, you begin to see the true purpose of it all. Not just to eat, but to immerse yourself in the grandeur of Roman culture. Remember, though, as you ease into the reclined position on your plush cushions, that Roman meals were as much about social status as they were about nutrition. From the bread served at the start to the mulsum wine at the end, each course signaled something important about where you stood in Roman society. For the upper classes, it was about making a statement, showcasing wealth, and aligning oneself with the empire's grandeur. For the lower classes, a shared meal might be simpler, but it was no less a reflection of the same values: community, hospitality, and the pleasures of life. As you look around the room, noticing the guests yawning and stretching, you realize that a Roman feast wasn't just about the food. It was an elaborate, multi-sensory experience designed to create an unforgettable memory. The ambiance was crucial. The soft glow of oil lamps flickering, the scent of roasted meats and fresh herbs filling the air, and the sound of music or gentle conversation setting the tone. All of it was carefully orchestrated to enhance the meal, making it more than just sustenance. The feast was a ritual, an art form that transformed food into something symbolic. And while the grandiosity of the elite's feasts is what history remembers, it's the everyday Roman meals, the simpler cena shared by families and workers, that give us a glimpse into the true diversity of Roman life. These meals, more humble than the lavish banquets of the rich, were still about connection, sharing bread, offering hospitality, and celebrating life's small joys. As you begin to relax further, you might wonder, did the average Roman ever truly get a chance to experience the opulence of a cena like this one? Or was it always reserved for the upper crust? Historically, we know that such feasts were often reserved for those with the means to host them. High-ranking politicians, military generals, and wealthy elites. The cena wasn't just a meal. It was a social arena where alliances were made, business deals were discussed, and social hierarchies were reinforced. As you lean back, the air thick with the pleasant warmth of good food and wine, you can almost hear the laughter of Roman aristocrats who, like today, enjoyed the company of friends as much as the luxuries of their lives. Now, let's shift our focus to a fascinating but often overlooked aspect of Roman dining: the drinks. You've already tasted the mulsum, that honeyed wine, but it wasn't the only beverage that graced Roman tables. In fact, Roman drinking culture was complex and varied, shaped by class, region, and the purpose of the gathering. Wine, naturally, was the drink of choice. but it came in many forms and qualities, from the inexpensive, watered-down wines enjoyed by the lower classes to the rich, heavily spiced wines favored by the elite. There was a drink for every occasion. Roman wine was usually diluted with water, a practice that might seem odd today, but made perfect sense to the Romans. Watered-down wine was not only safer to drink than untreated water, but it also served as a social signal. If you were served wine without dilution, it was a sign that you were a guest of honor or of high social standing. For the average Roman, the wine would be diluted to about 1 part wine to 2 or 3 parts water, making it lighter and easier to drink throughout the evening without becoming too intoxicated. This wasn't about getting drunk. It was about socializing, relaxing, and enjoying the process of drinking as much as the taste itself. But while wine was the most common drink, there were other options. Pasca, a popular drink among soldiers and lower-class Romans, was made by mixing vinegar with water. It sounds unpleasant, but it was highly refreshing in the hot Mediterranean climate and served as a cheap and easy way to stay hydrated. For the elites, however, the cena could feature much rarer beverages. Some banquets boasted imported drinks, like saba, a kind of thick, sweet syrup made from grape juice, or even defrutum, a reduced wine syrup often used in sauces or as a drink on its own. In addition to these drinks, Romans also enjoyed the occasional liquamen, or acetum, vinegar-based drinks. While we might find the idea of drinking vinegar strange today, these drinks were a common part of Roman life, and surprisingly, were even considered healthy by some. Acetum was often consumed after meals to aid digestion, and it was believed to have medicinal properties. At the end of your meal, as the table clears and guests begin to stretch, you might be offered a final glass of diluted wine, or perhaps even some pasca to wash down the last bits of libum. This quiet, reflective moment at the table would mark the true end of your Roman feast. The laughter begins to taper off. Guests rise to bid their farewells, and the host might thank everyone for attending. The evening has been long, filled with talk of politics, the empire's latest victories, and perhaps even a little gossip about who's been cheating at dice games. It's easy to see why such gatherings were an essential part of Roman society, more than just a way to eat. They were an opportunity for connection and power play, all wrapped up in food, drink, and social interaction. By the time the final guests leave and the lights flicker out, the echoes of this grand meal will linger in your mind, a reminder of the incredible complexity of Roman dining. Historians still argue whether these feasts were an essential part of Roman political life, or if they were simply elaborate ways for the wealthy to indulge. Either way, one thing is clear: Roman meals, from the simplest to the most extravagant, were more than just about food. They were about creating a lasting impression, building relationships, and making sure no one ever forgot the power and luxury of being Romans. As the evening winds down and the last guests begin to leave, there's one final, crucial element of Roman dining that we haven't fully explored: the after-dinner rituals. This part of the feast may not have involved more food or drink, but It was perhaps the most significant of all, serving as the grand finale of the social performance that had unfolded. In many ways, it was an integral part of Roman dining culture, providing both a satisfying conclusion and a subtle reminder of Roman power and prestige. The most common practice after the meal was a leisurely stroll or ambulation through the garden, often accompanied by music and gentle conversation. Imagine the soft murmurs of the guests as they stretch their legs after hours of reclining on cushions, the sounds of soft flutes or lyres drifting on the evening breeze. These post-feast strolls were as much about relaxation as they were about showing off the beauty of one's garden. The gardens themselves were often as opulent as the meals, with fountains, statues, and sprawling plots of flowers and fruit trees that highlighted the host's wealth and taste. But what about the ritual of convivium itself? After a meal, it wasn't uncommon for guests to engage in entertainment, particularly intellectual debates, games, or performances of poetry. The Romans, particularly the elites, placed a high value on eloquence and wit. Having your convivium end with a lively discussion on philosophy, politics, or the latest works of a poet or playwright was considered not just a delightful way to pass the time, but a sign of cultural sophistication. Of course, not all Roman feasts were so intellectually inclined. For some, entertainment meant games and competitive drinking challenges. Trophies for winning at these games were often served up alongside more food, ensuring that the feast went on into the night. Games like dice, tabula, a precursor to backgammon, and even musical contests were frequent pastimes for Roman diners. These games, of course, helped break up the monotony of endless food, and they served a dual purpose: entertainment and ensuring that everyone stayed well-fed and merry. But one particular after-dinner ritual stands out as both strange and somewhat fascinating: the Roman custom of vomiting to make room for more food. Yes, you heard that right. It wasn't uncommon for the wealthier Romans to engage in vomitoriums, spaces dedicated to the act of purging in order to continue their indulgent feasts. These were not rooms where people casually went to be sick, as is sometimes wrongly assumed, but were instead more of a cultural phenomenon. The idea behind the vomitorium was that after eating too much, one could purge themselves and return to the banquet table to continue the festivities. Though the practice was certainly associated with the elite, historians still debate whether vomitoriums were as widespread as ancient texts suggest, or if they were exaggerated. Regardless, the idea of eating in excess and then vomiting to continue eating or to make room for more wine certainly adds a peculiar twist to the Roman dining experience. While vomitoriums might seem over the top today, they underscore the Romans' relationship with excess and indulgence. Food wasn't merely sustenance, it was a symbol of control, pleasure, and social dominance. The idea of forcing the body to continue consuming, no matter how much had already been eaten, speaks to the Roman desire for complete mastery over one's environment, whether it was a city, a battle, or a banquet table. As guests finish their strolls, the last traces of food are cleared away, and the evening begins to wrap up. It's a slow, comfortable conclusion to a long and indulgent evening. The host might offer final words of thanks, and guests would slowly take their leave, their bellies full and their minds still engaged with the discussions of the night. The air would feel still and warm, heavy with the scent of fresh herbs and the last remnants of wine. Now, for the average Roman, such grand convivia, or feasts, were reserved for special occasions. The everyday cena, the simpler meals eaten by most Romans, were far less elaborate, but they were no less important. These humble dinners, often consisting of bread, vegetables, cheese, and a small portion of meat or fish, were still shared with family and friends, providing the same sense of social connection. However, while a simple cena might lack the pomp and circumstance of an elite banquet, it still had its own rhythm, with its own rituals and pleasures. Yet, the cena of the elite, a meal full of opulent dishes, endless wine, and post-feast entertainment, remains the archetype that most people associate with Roman dining. The idea of sitting back on a couch, reclining as the courses are served, with musicians playing soft melodies in the background and delicate conversation swirling around you, is a picture of luxury that has captivated historians and dreamers for centuries. It's easy to imagine yourself in that world, surrounded by the fine porcelain of the day, the heady scent of roasted meats, the laughter of good company. Even with all the luxury, however, the Romans knew that food was not just about indulgence. It was about creating bonds, about ensuring that everyone left the table feeling satisfied, both physically and socially. So, as the last guests exit your villa and you begin to tidy up, you're left with a sense of contentment, not just from the rich food and wine, but from the conviviality, the culture, and the memories of a night that, for the Romans, was never just about eating. And that, in many ways, is the lasting legacy of Roman dining culture. The understanding that food is not just fuel, it's a way to connect, to enjoy life, and to celebrate the good things that come when people gather together. Historians still debate whether the Roman elite's excessive feasts were an anomaly or part of a broader cultural trend toward indulgence. But one thing remains clear: Roman dining was as much about socializing and showcasing power as it was about the food itself. And as you settle into the evening's quiet, perhaps a hint of that Roman spirit lingers in your own home. The idea that a meal is never just about filling the stomach, but about the shared experience, the connection, and the pleasure of being together. Now that the guests have long since departed and the servants have cleared the table, you find yourself resting in the fading warmth of the evening. It's a time to reflect on the meal, to let the fullness settle in, and perhaps even feel a little drowsy from all that food and drink. The echoes of laughter and conversation still linger in the air, but now the world around you seems quieter, more tranquil. You've experienced the grandeur and indulgence of a Roman feast. But what was the real legacy of these meals? Was it simply about luxury? Or was there something deeper at play in the grand design of Roman dining? As you relax into the cushions, you might consider the role of food in Roman life beyond the banquet table. Food wasn't just a marker of social status at elite convivia. It was a reflection of Roman society's values, their vast empire, and the way they understood the world around them. The way the Romans viewed food is deeply intertwined with their approach to culture, politics, and even their empire-building efforts. For example, one of the defining characteristics of Roman dining was the use of food to demonstrate power, both within the household and on the national stage. The most extravagant banquets were about more than just feasting. They were about showcasing the host's ability to control resources, from exotic ingredients to elaborate dishes. But the empire's vastness meant that this wasn't just about luxury, it was also about cultural exchange. Roman elite diners had access to ingredients from all corners of the empire, from North Africa's garum, a fermented fish sauce, to spices from the Far East and produce from the far reaches of Gaul, Spain, and beyond. This global network of trade and influence, bound together by food, reflected the Romans' broader imperial ambitions and their capacity to bring distant lands under their control. Historians still argue whether food and dining were purely symbols of wealth or whether they served a more utilitarian function. One theory is that Roman feasts were carefully constructed to display the host's power and wealth. But there was also a deeply embedded sense of Roman pride in offering a feast that demonstrated the strength of the empire and its economic might. At times, these feasts acted as political tools, enabling patrons to make allies or silence rivals with the promise of an indulgent cena. Guests were not only impressed by the opulence of the meal, they were also subtly reminded of the host's influence and status. But what about the Roman lower classes? What did cena look like for those who didn't have the wealth to host elaborate feasts? While the extravagant banquets of the elites dominate historical narratives, the everyday meals of the common Roman are often overlooked. Yet, these simple meals were far from dull. They too were deeply meaningful and connected to Roman identity. Bread was the staple of Roman meals, a symbol of sustenance and survival. This humble food provided the foundation for a meal, whether it was paired with a little cheese or dipped in olive oil. For poorer Romans, meals were often prepared with whatever ingredients were available locally, but the dining experience itself was still central to Roman culture. Interestingly, Roman bread wasn't always as we know it today. While panis, bread, was a ubiquitous part of Roman meals, it wasn't always white and fluffy. Roman bread came in many varieties, and the poorer classes often had access to darker, coarser bread made from a mixture of grains. Richer Romans, however, were able to enjoy finer bread made from refined wheat, and in some cases, they even flavored their bread with herbs or honey. Despite these variations, bread always held a place of prominence, and the panis was often consumed in large quantities during every meal. Bread, wine, and olives, these were the essentials of Roman life, grounding the meal even for the wealthiest of Romans. Beyond bread, the Roman diet often featured vegetables, beans, and pulses. Common meals could include pulse, a thick porridge made from wheat or barley, served with vegetables, cheese, or a little bit of meat if the family could afford it. These meals may have lacked the grandeur of the elite's cena, but they were still tied to the Roman belief in moderatio, a sense of balance and simplicity in life. For the average Roman, a meal wasn't just about the food, it was about maintaining a healthy lifestyle, ensuring the family's well being, and adhering to cultural norms. As you drift into your own comfortable space, reflecting on the contrasting experiences of the rich and poor Romans, it's fascinating to think about how food carried meaning at every level of Roman society. Even though the banquet tables of the elite were heaving with exotic foods and wines, the dining practices of the Roman plebeians were also a direct reflection of the values of the empire. The Romans knew that food wasn't just about fueling the body, it was about connecting people to their society, to their beliefs, and to their culture. Historians still debate whether the difference between elite and plebeian meals was as stark as we imagine today. Some suggest that the lines between these dining experiences were blurrier than we think, with poorer Romans occasionally being invited to partake in grand feasts. But regardless of these debates, one thing is clear: food was deeply embedded in the social fabric of Roman life. From humble bowls of porridge to extravagant platters of roast peacock, every meal was part of the broader cultural narrative that connected Romans across the empire. As you recline back in your chair, the day's events, the meal, the conversation, the laughter, begin to drift into the background, replaced by the warmth and satisfaction of a full stomach. Whether you were lounging in a Roman villa or simply experiencing this grand feast in your mind, you can't help but appreciate the complexity of the meal. It wasn't just about eating, it was about culture, about history, about social dynamics, and about the artistry that went into creating such an elaborate, multi-course experience. The Roman meal, in all its opulence, had a far-reaching significance, one that impacted Roman society, politics, and even their understanding of the world. It's a reminder that food has always been a symbol of much more than mere sustenance. It is a way to tell a story, to communicate values, and to bring people together. And as you settle into the evening, you realize that the experience of the Roman feast has come full circle. The grand banquets may be over, but the deeper understanding of Roman culture, of food, and of connection remains. You've been transported, if only for a moment, into the heart of Roman society, where the power of food and the joy of sharing a meal with others transcended time and place. Now that the guests have long since departed and the servants have cleared the table, you find yourself resting in the fading warmth of the evening. It's a time to reflect on the meal, to let the fullness settle in, and perhaps even feel a little drowsy from all that food and drink. The echoes of laughter and conversation still linger in the air, but now the world around you seems quieter, more tranquil. You've experienced the grandeur and indulgence of a Roman feast. But what was the real legacy of these meals? Was it simply about luxury, or was there something deeper at play in the grand design of Roman dining? As you relax into the cushions, you might consider the role of food in Roman life beyond the banquet table. Food wasn't just a marker of social status at elite convivia. It was a reflection of Roman society's values, their vast empire, and the way they understood the world around them. The way the Romans viewed food is deeply intertwined with their approach to culture, politics, and even their empire-building efforts. For example, One of the defining characteristics of Roman dining was the use of food to demonstrate power, both within the household and on the national stage. The most extravagant banquets were about more than just feasting. They were about showcasing the host's ability to control resources, from exotic ingredients to elaborate dishes. But the empire's vastness meant that this wasn't just about luxury, it was also about cultural exchange. Roman elite diners had access to ingredients from all corners of the empire, from North Africa's garum, a fermented fish sauce, to spices from the Far East and produce from the far reaches of Gaul, Spain, and beyond. This global network of trade and influence, bound together by food, reflected the Romans' broader imperial ambitions and their capacity to bring distant lands under their control. Historians still argue whether food and dining were purely symbols of wealth or whether they served a more utilitarian function. One theory is that Roman feasts were carefully constructed to display the host's power and wealth. But there was also a deeply embedded sense of Roman pride in offering a feast that demonstrated the strength of the empire and its economic might. At times, these feasts acted as political tools, enabling patrons to make allies or silence rivals with the promise of an indulgent cena. Guests were not only impressed by the opulence of the meal, they were also subtly reminded of the host's influence and status. But what about the Roman lower classes? What did cena look like for those who didn't have the wealth to host elaborate feasts? While the extravagant banquets of the elites dominate historical narratives, the everyday meals of the common Roman are often overlooked. Yet, these simple meals were far from dull. They too were deeply meaningful and connected to Roman identity. Bread was the staple of Roman meals, a symbol of sustenance and survival. This humble food provided the foundation for a meal, whether it was paired with a little cheese or dipped in olive oil. For poorer Romans, meals were often prepared with whatever ingredients were available locally. But the dining experience itself was still central to Roman culture. Interestingly, Roman bread wasn't always as we know it today. While panis, bread, was a ubiquitous part of Roman meals, it wasn't always white and fluffy. Roman bread came in many varieties, and the poorer classes often had access to darker, coarser bread made from a mixture of grains. Richer Romans, however, were able to enjoy finer bread made from refined wheat, and in some cases, they even flavored their bread with herbs or honey. Despite these variations, bread always held a place of prominence, and the panis was often consumed in large quantities during every meal. Bread, wine, and olives, these were the essentials of Roman life, grounding the meal even for the wealthiest of Romans. Beyond bread, the Roman diet often featured vegetables, beans, and pulses. Common meals could include pulse, a thick porridge made from wheat or barley, served with vegetables, cheese, or a little bit of meat if the family could afford it. These meals may have lacked the grandeur of the elite's cena, but they were still tied to the Roman belief in moderatio, a sense of balance and simplicity in life. For the average Roman, a meal wasn't just about the food. It was about maintaining a healthy lifestyle, ensuring the family's well-being, and adhering to cultural norms. As you drift into your own comfortable space, reflecting on the contrasting experiences of the rich and poor Romans, it's fascinating to think about how food carried meaning at every level of Roman society. Even though the banquet tables of the elite were heaving with exotic foods and wines, the dining practices of the Roman plebeians were also a direct reflection of the values of the empire. The Romans knew that food wasn't just about fueling the body, it was about connecting people to their society, to their beliefs, and to their culture. Historians still debate whether the difference between elite and plebeian meals was as stark as we imagine today. Some suggest that the lines between these dining experiences were blurrier than we think, with poorer Romans occasionally being invited to partake in grand feasts. But regardless of these debates, one thing is clear: food was deeply embedded in the social fabric of Roman life. From humble bowls of porridge to extravagant platters of roast peacock, every meal was part of the broader cultural narrative that connected Romans across the empire. As you recline back in your chair, the day's events, the meal, the conversation, the laughter, begin to drift into the background, replaced by the warmth and satisfaction of a full stomach. Whether you were lounging in a Roman villa or simply experiencing this grand feast in your mind, you can't help but appreciate the complexity of the meal. It wasn't just about eating, it was about culture, about history, about social dynamics, and about the artistry that went into creating such an elaborate, multi-course experience. The Roman meal, in all its opulence, had far-reaching significance, one that impacted Roman society, politics, and even their understanding of the world. It's a reminder that food has always been a symbol of much more than mere sustenance. It is a way to tell a story, to communicate values, and to bring people together. And as you settle into the evening, you realize that the experience of the Roman feast has come full circle. The grand banquets may be over, but the deeper understanding of Roman culture, of food, and of connection remains. You've been transported, if only for a moment, into the heart of Roman society, where the power of food and the joy of sharing a meal with others transcended time and place. The night deepens further, and as you settle back more comfortably, we move from the humble scene of the working Romans to explore an even deeper and more intimate aspect of their relationship with food. How their diet was tied to their personal and social identities. For the Romans, food was never just about eating. It was about understanding their place in the world, their health, their social status, and even their moral values. From medicine to philosophy, Romans approached food with a complex, nuanced perspective. First, let's think about the role of food in Roman health and medicine. Ancient Roman doctors didn't have the kind of advanced medical knowledge we do today, but they were incredibly adept at using food as a means of promoting health and healing. One of the most fascinating aspects of Roman food culture was its close connection to humorism, the ancient belief that the body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each of these humors needed to be in balance for a person to be healthy. If a person's humors were out of balance, they could suffer from illness. And this is where food came in. A Roman diet wasn't just about filling your stomach. It was a way of ensuring that these humors stayed in harmony. Foods were often classified according to their effects on the body, whether they were hot or cold, wet or dry. For example, certain foods, like meat and wine, were thought to be hot foods that could stimulate the body and invigorate it. These foods were recommended for individuals who were sluggish or suffering from cold conditions, both literally and metaphorically. In contrast, foods like milk, cucumbers, and lettuce were considered cold, ideal for calming the body and reducing inflammation. Historians still debate whether the Romans truly understood the physiological mechanisms behind their food choices, or if they were simply following long-held traditions based on observation and trial. What we do know is that Roman physicians, like Galen, recommended diets that took into account a patient's personality, climate, and lifestyle. Galen was particularly interested in the therapeutic benefits of food and created elaborate dietary plans for his patients. Imagine him advising you not just to eat for nutrition, but to tailor every bite to your personal constitution. This approach was taken so seriously that it permeated Roman family life. When you walked into a Roman household, you would likely find that each member of the family had their own specific dietary needs. The elderly, for example, might be given warm, rich broths made from chicken or lamb to maintain their strength, while children would be encouraged to eat more nourishing, wet foods to aid their growth. Food wasn't just fuel, it was a means of self-care, of maintaining balance and harmony, inside and out, and beyond the physical realm. Food was also deeply connected to Roman moral philosophy. In the eyes of the Romans, dining habits were a reflection of personal discipline and virtue. The ideal Roman, according to philosophers like Cicero and Seneca, was someone who demonstrated virtues, a set of moral qualities, including moderation, self-control, and balance. A person who ate too much or indulged in excess was seen as morally weak and undisciplined. In a society where public reputation was of utmost importance, overeating at a banquet could tarnish one's image, but the opposite was also true. Refusing food or showing disdain for a meal could be seen as equally problematic. To reject food entirely was to reject the customs that bound Roman society together. For the Romans, eating together was a vital social act, a bonding experience, and part of the social contract. As a result, food wasn't just about satisfying hunger, it was a symbol of shared culture and camaraderie. This leads us to an interesting aspect of Roman dining that you may not have expected: the role of fasting in Roman society. While it's easy to think of the Romans as an indulgent, banquet-obsessed culture, they also had a long tradition of fasting, both for spiritual and health reasons. Many Romans participated in religious fasts to honor gods or cleanse themselves spiritually. These fasts, however, were often not about deprivation or abstention from food entirely, but rather about moderation and control. Some Romans, like the philosopher Epictetus, even argued that fasting could help you develop self-mastery, a key virtue in Stoic philosophy. To deny yourself certain pleasures, including food, was a way to show mastery over your desires and emotions. In fact, Some Roman thinkers took fasting to such an extreme that they promoted it as a way of achieving intellectual clarity and even personal enlightenment. Still, there were limits to how far the Romans would go. Fasting in Roman society wasn't about starving yourself, but rather about controlling your appetite and your approach to food. It was less about what you ate and more about how you ate. This philosophy reflects the Roman belief that food and the act of eating was a deeply personal experience that connected both the body and the soul. Food had to be consumed in the right quantities, at the right times, and with the right attitude. As you digest all this information, you begin to see how food wasn't just a private act in Roman culture. It was a social and moral one as well. Every meal, every choice about what to eat and how much was tied to deeper cultural values that went far beyond simple sustenance. To be Roman was to consider not just the body's needs, but also the mind, the spirit, and the connections between people. Historians continue to debate the extent to which Roman food practices influenced their broader cultural ideals. Some argue that food was one of the primary vehicles through which the Romans expressed their identity and ideals, while others believe that it was just a small part of the complex web of influences that shaped Roman life. What is certain, however, is that food in ancient Rome was far more than just something to eat. It was about self-control, about community, and about living in accordance with the values of the empire. As you relax and continue to reflect on Roman dietary practices, you realize how much deeper food runs in their culture than you might have thought. From garum to panis, from lavish banquets to humble porridge, food was not just about satisfying hunger. It was about status, about health, about morality, and about the intricate ties between individuals and the society around them. Eating, for the Romans, was never just a private act. It was part of the great public story of their civilization. The deeper we dive into Roman food culture, the more intricate and surprising it becomes. From the humble workers to the grand elites, Roman dining practices weren't just about the food on the table. They were about rituals, symbols, and a deep-seated sense of the sacred. And while we've focused largely on meals and dietary needs, it's time to shift gears and consider an equally important aspect: the role of food in Roman festivals, celebrations, and religious rituals. It's in these occasions where we see the intersection of food, community, and belief at its most vivid. In ancient Rome, food was never simply about sustenance. It was also about honoring the gods. The Roman pantheon, with its vast array of gods and goddesses, demanded regular attention and worship, and meals were often a central part of these religious observances. The most famous Roman festival associated with food, of course, was the Saturnalia, a week-long celebration dedicated to the god Saturn, during which social norms were temporarily overturned, and everyone, from slaves to emperors, shared in the feasting and revelry. During Saturnalia, food was abundant, and the entire city seemed to be in a state of joyous abandon. Slaves were given temporary freedom, and masters served them at the table, breaking the usual hierarchies of Roman society. The highlight, though, was the abundance of food. It wasn't just about eating, it was about ensuring that the gods were satisfied and that the year ahead would be prosperous. Offerings of wine, grain, and cooked meats were made to Saturn, who was associated with the harvest and wealth, as well as the natural cycles of life. Historians still argue about how much of the feasting was done in reverence and how much was simply an excuse to indulge in the pleasures of food and drink. There's evidence to suggest that some of the more extravagant festivities during Saturnalia could get a bit out of hand, with overindulgence in food and drink leading to wild behavior and even chaotic scenes. And yet, the symbolism behind these meals was deeply ingrained in Roman culture. It wasn't just about having a good time, it was about ensuring the gods were pleased and ensuring that the future of Rome itself would be bountiful. Beyond Saturnalia, food played a key role in other religious festivals as well. The Romans believed that the act of offering food to the gods was a way to maintain the divine favor necessary for the well-being of the city. There were annual offerings made at the Temple of Ceres, goddess of agriculture, where the harvest was celebrated with grains, fruits, and vegetables. Likewise, meat offerings to Mars, the god of war, were meant to secure victory and strength in battle. A meal shared in the presence of the gods was thought to create a sacred bond, ensuring the favor of the divine in all aspects of Roman life. This idea of food as a form of sacred exchange is also reflected in the Roman practice of lectus tricliniaris, or the dining couch, which was often used during special feasts and sacrifices. Meals were served on reclining couches arranged around a central table, and the dining experience was an event designed for contemplation, luxury, and deep connection, both with the gods and with the people present. This was an atmosphere far removed from the modern rush of eating in front of a screen or alone. In ancient Rome, meals were ritualized gatherings, a place where food had both a spiritual and social function. But not all Roman meals were part of a grand feast. In fact, many religious observances were quite subtle, involving simple offerings of food as a sign of respect. These could be anything from a small loaf of bread placed on an altar to the offering of fruit, eggs, or wasna. These offerings were often intended to mark the changing seasons or to celebrate key moments in the agricultural calendar. While these rituals might seem small, they played an integral part in the everyday lives of Romans, ensuring that their relationship with the divine was kept alive and healthy. The role of food in Roman festivals and religious rituals speaks volumes about how entwined the act of eating was with spiritual and social life. It wasn't just about filling the stomach. It was about honoring the greater forces at play, acknowledging the importance of community, and, of course, ensuring that one's place in society was maintained. Food was a powerful symbol, and its role in religious practices showed just how significant it was in shaping the Roman worldview. You might imagine the grand banquet halls of the Roman elites, filled with platters of roasted meats, fruits, and wine, the air heavy with the smell of incense and the sound of music, as the gods themselves were honored in the rich, fragrant aromas of the feast. There's something distinctly comforting in that image, isn't there? The idea that food has always been more than just nutrition, that it carries a weight of meaning, tradition, and spirituality. And as the evening drifts on, you may begin to see food in a whole new light, just as the Romans did, as something sacred, as something shared, as something deeply human. Historians still debate the long-term impact of these feasts and festivals on Roman society. Were they a form of social glue, binding the people together through ritual and shared experience? Or were they more about reinforcing power and hierarchy, creating spectacles that reinforced the social order? Some scholars argue that the Saturnalia and other festivals were as much about creating an illusion of equality as they were about genuine social harmony. Still, the fact remains that food played a central role in every aspect of Roman life, both sacred and secular, as you picture the bustling market stalls, the quiet family dinners, and the grand feasts of the rich and powerful. One thing becomes clear: food in ancient Rome was never a mere afterthought. It was a thread that ran through every part of society, sustaining, symbolizing, and uniting people across time, class, and belief. As we continue on this journey through the Roman culinary world, it's time to explore another fascinating dimension of Roman food culture: its vast trade networks, and how the Romans managed to bring the world's ingredients to their tables. From their early days as a small city-state, the Romans developed intricate trade routes that spanned the entire Mediterranean world and beyond. These routes allowed for the exchange not only of goods and materials, but of ideas, and food played a central role in this exchange. The Romans, in many ways, were master logisticians, and this extended to their food supply chains. By 100 AD, the Roman Empire had established extensive networks for transporting foodstuffs across its territories. These routes were essential for feeding the growing population of Rome, which could reach over 1 million people at its peak. You can imagine, feeding such a large city required an extraordinary amount of food, and not just any food, but the finest ingredients from all over the known world. Take, for instance, the Roman fondness for fish sauce, specifically garum, which we've already mentioned briefly. This pungent, fermented fish sauce became a staple in Roman kitchens, found in nearly every dish. Garum was so beloved that it was produced in vast quantities and traded across the empire. The Romans even had specialized factories where fish were fermented in large vats to produce the sauce, and the finished product was shipped to places as far as Britannia and Hispania. Garum was an essential ingredient for flavoring everything from meats to vegetables, and its widespread popularity made it one of the most important food exports of the empire. In addition to garum, the Romans imported a range of other ingredients, some of which we might find surprising today. For example, spices such as black pepper, cinnamon, and ginger were highly prized in Roman cooking, but these spices didn't grow anywhere near Rome. Instead, they came from India and the Far East, making their way through complex trade routes known as the Silk Roads. The Romans were in direct contact with these distant lands, and their love for exotic spices led to the creation of a flourishing trade in luxury goods. For Romans, having pepper or cinnamon in their spice cabinet was a sign of wealth and sophistication. Historians still debate the exact scale of the spice trade, during Roman times, with some arguing that the Romans were far less interested in spices than we've been led to believe. Others suggest that Roman aristocrats were willing to pay exorbitant sums for these exotic goods. Either way, it's clear that Roman food culture was a blend of local ingredients and exotic imports, which helped create a cuisine that was as diverse as the empire itself. The most famous of the Roman trade networks, of course, was the Mediterranean Sea. The Romans had mastered naval travel and trade, allowing them to ferry goods from North Africa, Egypt, Spain, and Greece, grain from Egypt, olive oil from Hispania, and wine from Gaul. These were just a few of the staples that made their way to Roman tables. The Egyptians were particularly important to Rome, supplying not just grain, but also fruits like figs and dates. Roman cooks even had access to exotic fruits like pomegranates, cherries, and peaches, ingredients that were a luxury for the average person, but could be found on the tables of the elite. Then there were the more unusual imports, such as the highly prized silks and perfumes from China. These items didn't find their way directly to Rome, but were traded through intermediary nations, with the goods being passed from one merchant to another along the way. By the time these goods reached the heart of the empire, they were considered symbols of extreme wealth and exclusivity, reserved for the Roman elite. And it wasn't just the foodstuffs themselves that were traded. The cooking techniques, recipes, and food preparation methods were shared and adapted across cultures. Roman chefs were quick to incorporate foreign spices, cooking methods, and even new vegetables into their repertoire. One such ingredient was the cucumis, a variety of cucumber that the Romans imported from Egypt and made into cold dishes and salads, a precursor to the modern salad we know today. In fact, some historians suggest that much of the foundation of what we now call Mediterranean cuisine was born in Rome, as the Romans borrowed and blended the foods of their neighbors and trading partners. What's fascinating is that the Roman Empire's vast trade system also included a system of food storage and preservation that was ahead of its time. The Romans were skilled at preserving foods for long-distance transport, particularly through salting, drying, and fermenting. Salted fish, dried fruits, and preserved meats could be shipped across the empire, ensuring that even distant outposts could enjoy Roman delicacies. Olive oil was another key commodity that traveled well, as it could be stored for months in sealed containers and used as a cooking fat or as a dressing. Yet for all their mastery over trade and food storage, the Romans weren't immune to supply issues. At certain points in Roman history, especially during times of war or economic downturn, food shortages could become a serious problem. There are accounts of food riots in the city of Rome when grain shipments were delayed or when prices soared too high for the average citizen to afford. During such times, the Roman government would step in and provide a nona, a grain dole, to ensure the people had enough to eat. It was in moments like these that food took on a more political role, with emperors using grain distribution as a way to maintain control and prevent unrest. In many ways, the story of Roman food is the story of the empire itself, expansive interconnected and full of both abundance and scarcity. The sheer scale of Roman trade and the effort it took to feed an empire of such size and diversity reveals just how important food was to the functioning of Roman society. Food wasn't just fuel, it was a commodity, a symbol, and a key player in the empire's complex political, economic, and social systems. As you think about these vast trade networks, the fruits and spices from faraway lands, and the clever ways the Romans preserved their food for travel, you may start to realize just how much the Roman Empire shaped the way we view food today. Their ability to mix local and exotic ingredients, to preserve and trade food across vast distances, and to create a culture where food was both sacred and symbolic. It's no wonder that their legacy continues to influence food culture in the modern world. Historians still debate whether the Romans truly understood the global nature of their trade empire, or if they simply took it for granted. What is clear, however, is that food was a crucial part of that empire, a symbol of both its reach and its complexity. As we finish reflecting on the Romans' remarkable food network, you might be left with the impression that the world of ancient Rome was more connected than we ever imagined. The empire wasn't just about grand spectacles and epic battles, it was also about food and the connections it created between people, places, and cultures. As we near the final chapters of our journey through the world of Roman food, it's time to turn our attention to one last but vitally important aspect: the food of the Roman elite, particularly their extravagant feasts and lavish banquets. The contrast between the everyday meals of the average Roman and the luxurious indulgences of the wealthy reveals a whole new world, one of opulence, excess, and a culture obsessed with status. Imagine yourself in the grand dining rooms of a Roman villa. You are reclining on your lectus, a cushioned couch designed for leisure, surrounded by fellow guests. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meats, freshly baked bread, and sweet wines. Your host, a wealthy patrician, gestures grandly to a procession of servants bringing in dish after dish. At these banquets, food wasn't just about sustenance. It was a statement of power, wealth, and taste. Each dish was an opportunity to show off the host's status, their ability to secure the rarest and most exotic ingredients, and their expertise in hosting the grandest feasts. One of the most important features of these banquets was their incredible variety. The wealthy Romans would often serve dozens of courses at a time, sometimes up to 20 or more. The meals would begin with appetizers, or gustatio, which included small bites like olives, eggs, and seafood. Then, the main courses would begin to arrive, each one more lavish than the last. Meat was often the centerpiece, particularly dishes made from pigs, goats, and even peacocks. Wealthy Romans would even serve extravagant dishes made from mormyrus, a rare fish found in the Nile River, imported all the way from Egypt. Historians still argue about how much the extravagance of these feasts was about genuine culinary appreciation versus the pure spectacle. Was the point of these meals to enjoy the food itself, or was it simply to demonstrate the wealth and taste of the host? Many scholars believe that these banquets were as much about theater as they were about food. It was about impressing guests with rare and luxurious items, and showing off one's ability to procure the finest ingredients from across the empire. When the host served dishes like roasted flamingo or stuffed dormice, it wasn't just about the enjoyment of the guests, it was about making a statement. One dish in particular became legendary among the Roman elite: thermopolia, or the rich, heated foods often served in the form of stews, soups, and sauces. These dishes were considered luxurious because of their complexity and the use of expensive spices. The Romans had perfected the art of spicing food, and the use of exotic spices such as pepper, saffron, and cinnamon would elevate even the simplest dish into a culinary masterpiece. But it wasn't just the richness of the food that made these banquets so extravagant. It was also the presentation. Meals were served in beautiful silver and gold dishes, and the food itself was often arranged in elaborate designs. Fruit might be carved into intricate shapes, or dishes could be presented in such a way that they looked almost like sculptures. There was an element of performance involved in the way the food was brought to the table. It was as if the meal itself was a work of art. One particularly lavish feature of these banquets was the use of vomitoria, or vomitoriums. Contrary to popular belief, these weren't rooms used to make guests vomit between courses so they could eat more, though that practice was indeed reported in some ancient sources. Rather, vomitoria were simply the architectural passageways in Roman theaters and amphitheaters, through which large crowds could vomit out of the space quickly. However, in the context of the feasts, this misinterpretation of the word became associated with the idea of excess and indulgence, possibly because some elite Romans were rumored to indulge in such extreme feasting habits that vomiting might be involved. Whether or not this was common practice is still debated among scholars, but it certainly fed into the modern-day myth of the Roman vomitorium. The question of how much excess was considered too much remains an interesting one. As we've already discussed, Roman philosophy emphasized moderation, particularly within the Stoic school of thought. Philosophers like Seneca and Epictetus would likely have frowned upon the type of indulgence that was common in these banquets. For them, the act of eating was something to be approached with simplicity and discipline. However, there was a stark divide between the ideals of philosophy and the reality of the Roman elite. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for high-status Romans to use their feasts as a way to show that they had transcended the need for basic sustenance, transforming food into an expression of power. Food was also an expression of family lineage and tradition. During these extravagant feasts, it was common for wealthy Romans to serve dishes that were tied to their family's history. Some families had signature dishes that were passed down through generations, and these meals carried deep symbolic meaning. The ability to prepare and serve these dishes was not just a mark of culinary skill, but also a sign of social standing. In addition to food, these feasts were often accompanied by entertainment such as music, dance, poetry, or even gladiatorial games. Imagine reclining on your lectus as you sip wine, listening to a poet recite epic tales of Roman history, or watching a slave perform a song. These banquets were an all-encompassing experience: food, drink, art, and spectacle, all mixed together to create an unforgettable, immersive event. But it wasn't just the large, formal banquets that were important in Roman culture. Even small, informal meals had deep social significance. The act of sharing a meal was a way of building alliances, forming relationships, and maintaining social status. In fact, the very act of dining together was considered a ritual that reinforced the bonds of Roman society, whether it was a simple meal between friends or a grand feast held for political gain. Food was a medium through which the Romans navigated their social world. At the heart of all this, food had one essential role: to unite people, whether it was a grand banquet in a villa or a humble meal shared among family members. Food played a critical part in creating connections, strengthening bonds, and expressing Roman values. It wasn't just about eating, it was about participating in a shared experience, a communal act that transcended individual needs. As we reflect on the opulent banquets of the Roman elite, we see how food was both a tool and a symbol in the expression of power and social dynamics. But we also see that no matter the scale of the feast, food remained a deeply human experience, a way of coming together, sharing stories, and creating memories. As we approach the final stages of our exploration into Roman food culture, it's time to take a step back and reflect on how food played a role in everyday Roman life, beyond the grand feasts and lavish banquets. For most Romans, their meals were not as extravagant, but they were still imbued with deep cultural significance. The kinds of food consumed, the way meals were prepared, and the manner in which Romans gathered around the table tells us a lot about the values and rhythms of daily life. While the elite dined on the rarest delicacies, the majority of Romans, especially those in the bustling urban centers like Rome itself, ate far more modestly. The typical meal for an average Roman might consist of pulse, a porridge made from farro or barley, and simple vegetables such as lentils, cabbage, and leeks. Meat was reserved for special occasions, with fish often being more accessible for everyday meals. Bread, on the other hand, was a staple for almost everyone, from the richest to the poorest. And yet, even these humble meals carried with them deep meaning and were often used to reinforce social bonds, status, and the rhythms of Roman life. One of the most important aspects of Roman eating habits was the idea of the cenatio, or the dinner table. The way a Roman household prepared for and participated in meals revealed much about their society. The cenatio was not just a place for eating, it was a space for social interaction and conversation, whether in a modest apartment or a grand villa. The table was where families and friends came together to discuss politics, philosophy, current events, or the latest gossip. In many ways, it was the heart of the Roman home. The table itself had a specific structure. A Roman dining table was often a simple affair, but it could be remarkably large depending on the wealth and size of the household. While the elite might have dined on couches, reclining in the Greek style, the average Roman typically sat around a simple wooden table, eating their meal with family members. Meals, particularly dinner, were a communal affair, where social hierarchies were reinforced through the order in which food was served. and who was permitted to eat first. Historians still debate the exact nature of the cena, the main meal of the day, particularly for the common Roman. Was it truly as humble as we imagine, or was there more variety in the meals of the working class Romans than we tend to believe? While we know that vegetables, beans, and grains formed the backbone of Roman food for many, there were occasions when even the poor could afford the occasional slice of meat or fish, depending on season and availability. Meat was generally expensive, and often only the wealthier classes could afford to eat it regularly. Still, the presence of meat, whether roasted, boiled, or fried, was a rare treat for many and was often consumed in small quantities. That said, even for the average Roman, a good pulse was filling and nutritious, and when seasoned with the right spices or herbs, it could be quite satisfying. Alongside this, Roman food culture was always guided by the principles of moderation. Unlike the excesses of the imperial banquets, daily Roman meals were designed to be nourishing and straightforward. While the elite indulged in intricate, spiced dishes and multi-course feasts, the majority of Romans made do with what was locally available: grains, legumes, and vegetables. The temperance of their meals was mirrored in Roman attitudes toward food in general. While the rich might display their affluence through indulgence, the middle and lower classes embraced the value of simplicity. It was part of a larger philosophical ethos that balanced self-restraint with enjoyment. The Romans were also among the first civilizations to devise systems for food distribution and public markets. In major Roman cities, public markets were common and vital, where vendors sold everything from vegetables to bread and meats. These markets were central hubs of daily life, bustling with the sounds of bartering and the smells of fresh produce and fish. The Forum, the center of Roman public life, often doubled as a market where citizens would gather not only for political discourse, but also to purchase food, while the wealthy Roman elite had access to private estates where they could cultivate their own food. For the majority of the population, the market was an essential lifeline for securing daily provisions. Interestingly, the Roman Empire also pioneered a system of food distribution for the urban poor, known as the annona. The annona was an organized program designed to ensure that even the poorest Roman citizens had access to basic food supplies, primarily grain. This distribution system was a key tool in preventing civil unrest, as food shortages had historically been one of the leading causes of political instability. The annona was an example of the Roman state's use of food as a means of social control, ensuring that even the most impoverished had at least enough to eat to avoid potential uprisings. Historians still debate the long-term impact of the annona on Roman society, with some suggesting it was a form of benevolent welfare, and others viewing it as a way to keep the lower classes passive and dependent on the state. Regardless of its intention, the system marked a shift in how food could be used as a tool for governing. It ensured that the city of Rome was never truly hungry, despite its massive population, which could easily have caused food crises if not for the efficient distribution network. As we draw our focus to the smaller, more intimate meals of the Roman populace, we begin to realize that food in the Roman world was far from an afterthought. It was an intrinsic part of the rhythm of life, from humble bowls of poles to the careful distribution of grain to the masses. Each meal, no matter how small or modest, had a larger role to play in the social, political, and economic structure of Roman society. It reinforced the divisions of class, the rituals of family life, and the ever-present necessity of food to sustain not just the body, but the empire itself. It's easy to picture the bustling Roman markets, or the quiet, intimate meals of a family gathered around a table. These images remind us that Roman food culture wasn't just about the lavish banquets of the rich. It was about survival, community, and the ways in which food wove its way through every aspect of Roman life, whether through a shared bowl of porridge or a carefully prepared feast. And as we consider how much Roman food has influenced our world today, from the spread of the garum trade to the humble pools, we start to see the lasting legacy of Roman culinary culture, not just in their empire, but in the everyday meals of people around the world. As we reach the final moments of our journey through Roman food, it's time to slow down and reflect on the legacy of Roman culinary traditions. How did this ancient civilization's relationship with food shape the world we live in today? Was it simply the exotic spices, intricate dishes, or the grand feasts that made Roman food culture so memorable? Or is there something deeper, something more profound, that links the ancient Romans with the food we enjoy in the modern world? Let's begin by looking at the ways Roman food influenced the cultures that followed them. After the fall of the Roman Empire, their culinary practices didn't simply disappear. Instead, they formed the basis for the development of many aspects of modern European cuisine. The Romans, with their remarkable ability to blend local and foreign ingredients, laid the foundation for much of the Mediterranean diet we know and love today. The use of olive oil, the emphasis on fresh vegetables, grains, and legumes, and even the art of creating sauces and dressings. These are all key components of the Mediterranean diet that trace their origins back to Roman times. One of the most enduring Roman legacies is the concept of vinum, wine. For the Romans, wine was not just a drink. It was a cultural cornerstone. It was consumed at every meal, from breakfast to dinner, and in every social setting, from intimate family gatherings to grand feasts. Roman wine, often diluted with water and flavored with spices, became a symbol of civilization and the life of the elite. They even had specific varieties of wine suited for different occasions, with some wines made to age for decades, just like the wines of modern Italy and France. Historians still debate how much the Roman influence on wine culture shaped the later wine regions of Europe. Some argue that the Romans were responsible for introducing winemaking techniques to regions such as France, Spain, and Italy. Others claim that these regions already had a winemaking tradition before the Romans arrived. But what the Romans did was perfect and standardize it. What we do know for sure is that Whether through direct influence or cultural exchange, the Romans solidified wine's place in European society, and its legacy continues to this day. Another lasting Roman influence is the spread of the concept of gastroliths, or the art of food presentation. As we mentioned earlier, Roman banquets were not just about food, they were spectacles in themselves, with each dish meticulously prepared and presented like a work of art. This tradition of making food visually appealing continued to thrive through the Middle Ages and Renaissance, when wealthy elites would often demand that their meals be displayed as elaborate visual feasts, complete with centerpieces and ornamental garnishes. To this day, food presentation remains an important part of dining culture, particularly in fine dining restaurants, where the look of the dish is nearly as important as the taste. But beyond the world of high society, Roman food culture also left a lasting mark on the way people eat in the modern world. The Romans' introduction of garum, the beloved fish sauce, is still felt today in various culinary traditions across the globe, from Southeast Asia's fish sauce to Italy's colatura di alici, the concept of fermenting fish to create a pungent, flavorful condiment was an innovation that spread long after the Roman Empire fell. In fact, some scholars argue that Roman garum might be considered the predecessor to the fish-based condiments we now use in many parts of the world. Even the very concept of a meal, the structuring of food into courses, the sharing of food with others, the role of food in social rituals was something the Romans helped define. The concept of the lunch and dinner as structured, multi-course events can be traced back to Roman dining practices. The Roman cena, with its distinct courses, gustatio, appetizers, prima mensa, main course, and secunda mensa, dessert, became the model for the multi-course meals that we now consider a standard part of modern dining. Looking beyond Europe, Roman culinary traditions were carried across the Mediterranean, influencing the food cultures of North Africa and the Middle East. Ancient Roman trade routes connected these regions in ways that allowed for the exchange of not just goods, but also food. The Romans were instrumental in bringing together the flavors and cooking techniques of North Africa, the Near East, and Europe, creating a culinary fusion that would lay the groundwork for much of the cuisine we associate with the Mediterranean today. What's fascinating is that in many ways, Roman food culture was rooted in their perception of food as more than mere sustenance. It was an art form, a means of self-expression, and a way to cultivate relationships. The act of sharing a meal was as important as the food itself. The Roman ideal of convivium, the communal meal, wasn't just about eating together. It was about building and maintaining bonds, both social and political. This idea of food as a communal experience has persisted through the centuries and remains a cornerstone of modern dining culture. Whether it's a family gathering around the table for a holiday feast or friends sharing tapas at a cafe, the idea of food bringing people together is something the Romans understood well. In the end, what makes Roman food culture so remarkable is its ability to transcend time. The Romans, with their far-reaching empire, shared their food and food practices with people from all corners of the ancient world. They didn't just eat to live, they used food to create culture, to build communities, and to express their identity. And in doing so, they created a food legacy that would continue to shape not only the empires that followed them, but also the way we experience food today. As we reflect on the Roman dining experience, it's hard not to feel a sense of connection, even though we are separated by thousands of years. We still gather around the table with family and friends to share meals that nourish both our bodies and our relationships. We may no longer serve garum-drenched dormice or sip mulsum from golden goblets, but in the act of sitting down to a meal, we continue the age-old tradition that the Romans began. In the end, perhaps that's the most enduring legacy of all, the way food, in all its simplicity and grandeur, continues to bring us together. Now, as we slowly bring this journey to a close, imagine yourself sitting at that ancient Roman table one last time. The last course has been served. The laughter and conversation have quieted, and the day winds to an end. With your belly full and your mind at ease, you can reflect on the pleasures and memories of a meal well enjoyed, a meal that connects you to a tradition that stretches across the millennia.